I stood at the edge of what used to be a 12-acre lake, looking down at cracked mud, dying cattails, and a single-stranded catfish flopping weakly in a puddle no bigger than a bathtub. And I want to tell you honestly that for the first 30 seconds or so, I couldn't make my mind accept what my eyes were actually showing me. My family's lake, the one my grandfather had stocked with bass and bluegill back in 1958, the one 3 generations of Kesslers had fished, swum in, and buried our dead within sight of, was simply gone. Drained overnight by a pumping operation, the Ridgemont Crossing Homeowners Association had authorized without a single word to me beforehand. My name is Franklin Kessler. I'm 57 years old, and my family has held recorded water rights to Kessler Lake since 1954, 3 years before my grandfather ever finished digging the impoundment that would eventually hold that water in place. I want to explain that distinction carefully, because it matters enormously to everything that happened afterward. In this state, and in a good number of others across the American West and parts of the Midwest, water rights and land rights aren't always the same thing and don't always transfer together automatically. My grandfather filed a formal water appropriation claim with the State Water Board in 1954, securing what's called a senior appropriative right to draw and impound water from Miller's Creek, the modest stream that fed the natural low point where he'd eventually build his lake. That right predates, by decades, every single water claim held by anyone connected to Ridgemont Crossing, the gated luxury development that had grown up around 3 sides of my property over the previous 15 years. I need to back up considerably further than that morning at the drained lake bed, because to understand exactly how a homeowners association came to believe it had any authority whatsoever to drain water my family had held senior rights to for 70 years, you have to understand the slow, patient encroachment that built up over more than a decade, and the particular kind of institutional confidence that convinces people they can simply take what they want as long as they move slowly enough that nobody notices until it's already done. My grandfather, Otto Kessler, bought the original 160 acres surrounding what would become Kessler Lake in 1951, land that included a natural low-lying basin fed by Miller's Creek, a modest but reliable stream running down off the ridge to the north. He recognized almost immediately that the basin could hold considerably more water than it naturally accumulated during wet seasons, and spent 3 years working primarily during winter months when his cattle operation demanded less of his time, building an earthen dam across the basin's natural outlet, creating what would eventually grow into a full 12-acre lake once he'd properly filed his water rights and begun actively impounding Miller's Creek's flow. I want to explain why that 1954 water rights filing mattered so much more than most people, unfamiliar with how water law actually works in practice, might initially assume. Under what's called the doctrine of prior appropriation, which governs water rights in a considerable portion of the country, the fundamental principle is straightforward: first in time, first in right. Whoever files a legitimate claim to use a specific water source first holds priority over anyone who files a similar claim later, regardless of who eventually owns the surrounding land, and regardless of how badly a later claimant might need or want that same water. My grandfather's 1954 filing made him, and eventually my father and then myself, the senior rights holder to Miller's Creek's flow into that basin, a priority that has never once lapsed, never once been challenged successfully, and never once been properly transferred to anyone outside my own family across 70 years of continuous use. My father, Otis Kessler, inherited the lake and the surrounding acreage in 1979, and continued the same careful stewardship his own father had practiced, maintaining the dam, keeping the water rights filing properly renewed and documented with the state board every single reporting period, and gradually building the lake into something considerably more than a simple stock pond. By the time I inherited the full property in 1998, following my father's death, Kessler Lake had become exactly what it remains in my own memory today: a genuine centerpiece of family life, host to 3 generations of summer fishing trips, my own children's first swimming lessons, and a small memorial bench near the eastern shore where my father's ashes had been scattered per his own explicit wishes. Ridgemont Crossing broke ground in 2009. Built on land that had previously belonged to the Hendricks family, longtime neighbors whose own farming operation had finally become unsustainable after years of declining commodity prices, made the math simply stop working for them. I had no particular objection to the development itself. The same way I've never believed my own preferences about how the surrounding countryside should look carry any weight over another landowner's right to sell their property to whoever they choose. My only concern, from the very beginning, involved making certain everyone understood clearly that Kessler Lake, despite sitting adjacent to the new development's southern boundary, remained entirely my family's private property, governed by water rights that had existed decades before Ridgemont Crossing was ever more than an idea in a developer's planning documents. I want to describe the specific geography here, because it matters to understanding exactly how this dispute eventually developed. Kessler Lake sits almost entirely on my own recorded parcel, but its southern shoreline runs directly along the boundary, separating my land from what became Ridgemont Crossing's own common area. A stretch of community green space the development's own marketing materials describe, somewhat presumptuously in my own assessment even in those early years, as offering serene lakefront views as part of the community's premium amenity package. I want to be clear that I never granted Ridgemont Crossing any rights whatsoever to that lake, its shoreline, or the water itself. But the development's own marketing had, from its very first brochure, treated my family's private lake as though it existed for the visual and recreational benefit of an entirely different community than the one that had actually built and maintained it across 3 generations. I first met Vivienne Castellan roughly 6 years before the lake was drained, not long after she took over as president of the Ridgemont Crossing Homeowners Association. She stopped by my property one afternoon, and I remember the conversation clearly because it established, right from the beginning, exactly the kind of presumptuous framing that would eventually culminate in draining my family's lake without so much as a phone call. "Mr. Kessler," she said, "the board has been discussing some exciting possibilities for enhancing our community's connection to the lake. We're thinking a small public dock, perhaps some kayak storage, really building out that premium waterfront experience our residents were promised when they bought into the community." I told her, as plainly as I know how to tell anyone anything, that the lake belonged entirely to my family, that no dock or kayak storage would ever be built on it without my express permission, and that whatever her residents had been promised by a marketing brochure had absolutely nothing to do with the actual legal reality of who owned that water and the land beneath it. She smiled, thanked me for my candor, and told me she hoped we could find a path toward what she called mutual benefit somewhere down the road. I want you to remember that phrase, mutual benefit, because it would resurface in one form or another throughout every single interaction I had with Vivienne Castellano over the following 6 years, always carrying the same unstated assumption that my lake's future somehow remained an open question rather than a settled matter of recorded law. The pattern of small encroachments began within the first year. Ridgemont Crossing's own landscaping crew installed a small gravel path and a scattering of decorative benches along a stretch of shoreline that sat, according to the recorded plat map I confirmed with the county the very same week, roughly 20 feet onto my own property. I called Vivienne directly, and after the now familiar cycle of expressed surprise, promised correction, and a delay of nearly 2 months, the benches and gravel were eventually removed, though the crew left behind enough disturbed soil and mulch residue that it took me most of a summer to properly restore the natural shoreline vegetation my father had always maintained so carefully. About 2 years later, I discovered that Ridgemont Crossing's own community newsletter had begun referring to the lake in print simply as Ridgemont Lake, dropping my family's name entirely from every subsequent mention. A small but deliberate rhetorical shift that I suspect was intended to slowly normalize, in the minds of hundreds of residents who had never once met me or understood the actual ownership history. The idea that this body of water belonged to their community rather than to mine. I sent a formal letter, through an attorney I'd retained specifically for this purpose, a careful and unhurried man named Gideon Marsh, demanding the newsletter correct its terminology and cease referring to my family's private lake using any name other than its actual, historically established one. The correction was eventually printed, 3 issues later, in a small paragraph buried on an interior page, considerably less prominent than the original mischaracterization had been. I want to describe one more incident before I get to the actual draining, because it illustrates exactly the kind of institutional confidence that eventually led Vivienne Castellano to believe she could simply pump 12 acres of water out of my family's lake without ever once picking up the phone to inform me. Roughly 18 months before the lake was drained, I received a formal letter from the association's own environmental committee, informing me that Kessler Lake had been identified as a significant mosquito breeding concern, affecting the health and safety of Ridgemont Crossing residents, and requesting that I submit to a formal environmental abatement plan developed in coordination with the association's own retained pest control contractor. I want to note that my own lake had never once, across 70 years of continuous family use, generated any documented mosquito complaint through the county health department, a fact I confirmed directly with that office the same week the letter arrived. Gideon's formal response made clear that the association possessed no legal authority whatsoever to compel any environmental abatement plan on private property outside its own boundary, particularly not property governed by senior water rights that predated the association's own existence by more than half a century. The morning I discovered the lake had been drained began, for me, with an entirely ordinary phone call from my daughter, who still lives in the area and drives past the property most mornings on her way to work. "Dad," she said, her voice carrying the particular confusion that comes from seeing something that simply doesn't match what you expect to see. "Something's wrong with the lake. It looks like it's almost completely gone." I drove out immediately, and I want to describe what I found in detail, because the physical evidence itself became critically important to everything that followed. A large industrial pump, still connected to a temporary discharge pipe, running toward what I would later learn was a partially completed parking lot excavation on Ridgemont Crossing's own property, sat abandoned near the lake's southern shore, apparently having run continuously for somewhere between 18 and 24 hours, based on the fuel consumption records I would eventually obtain. 12 acres of water, 70 years of continuous family stewardship, gone in less than a full day, leaving behind a cracked, drying lake bed, stranded and dying fish, and a small memorial bench near the eastern shore now sitting, absurdly and heartbreakingly, in the middle of exposed mud rather than beside the water it had always overlooked. I called Vivienne Castellano directly, and I want to describe her explanation, because it revealed exactly the kind of casual entitlement that had apparently been building for 6 full years beneath the surface of every previous interaction. "Mr. Kessler," she said, "the board approved a drainage and stormwater management plan that required temporary lowering of the lake level to facilitate construction of our new resident parking facility. We understood this was a shared community resource, and frankly, given how much our residents have always appreciated that lake, we assumed you'd understand the mutual benefit of expanding our community's amenities." Mutual benefit. That same phrase, 6 years later, now attached to 12 acres of drained water, and a dead ecosystem that had taken my grandfather 3 years to properly establish, and my family 70 years to maintain. I called Gideon Marsh immediately, and his response, once he understood the full scope of what had happened, was direct and unambiguous. "Franklin," he said, "this isn't simply a boundary dispute or an encroachment issue anymore. Draining water impounded under a senior appropriative right, without authorization from the rights holder, potentially constitutes both a serious civil claim and, depending on how the State Water Board views the unauthorized diversion, a regulatory violation carrying its own separate penalties entirely apart from whatever damages we pursue against the association directly. I want to explain what emerged once Gideon's formal investigation got fully underway, because the draining itself, devastating as it was on its own, turned out to be only the most visible piece of a considerably larger pattern of institutional carelessness. Gideon's formal records request to the State Water Board revealed that Ridgemont Crossing's own construction contractor had applied for a temporary water diversion permit to support the parking lot excavation, listing Kessler Lake as an available water source without ever once confirming who actually held the recorded appropriative rights to that water. The Water Board's own permitting office, reviewing an incomplete application that simply listed the lake's general location without cross-referencing the state's own senior rights database, approved a temporary diversion permit that should never have been granted in the first place. Given that my family's 1954 filing sat clearly on record the entire time, fully searchable, fully documented, and entirely ignored by everyone involved in approving this specific construction project, I want to be fair and note that this represented a genuine institutional failure extending beyond Vivienne Castellan and the Ridgemont Crossing Board alone. The Water Board's own permitting process, Gideon's investigation eventually confirmed, had approved at least 2 other temporary diversion permits over the preceding 5 years without properly cross-referencing the senior rights database. A systemic gap that the board itself, once formally notified of the Kessler Lake incident, acknowledged required immediate procedural correction going forward. I want to describe what emerged regarding Vivienne Castellano's own knowledge and decision-making, because it mattered enormously to how the eventual legal proceedings unfolded. A board member named Cordelia Prout, who had grown increasingly uncomfortable with Vivienne's leadership over the preceding 2 years, reached out to Gideon's office directly once word of the draining spread through the development, explaining that she had personally raised concerns during an internal planning session roughly 4 months before the parking lot project began, regarding whether the association had properly confirmed water rights ownership before including the lake in any construction planning at all. I specifically asked whether anyone had checked who actually held rights to that water, Cordelia told Gideon, in a formal statement that would eventually become part of the court record. Vivienne told the committee she'd already confirmed everything was fine, that the lake had always functioned as a shared community resource, and there wouldn't be any issue. I trusted that assurance completely, and I deeply regret not pushing harder for actual documentation before we proceeded. I want to note that Cordelia's account, once formally corroborated through internal committee meeting notes Gideon obtained during discovery, revealed that Vivienne had never actually contacted my family, never reviewed the county's recorded water rights filings, and never sought any confirmation whatsoever beyond her own personal, unfounded assumption that 70 years of my family's documented stewardship somehow constituted community property, simply because Ridgemont Crossing's own marketing materials had described it that way for 15 years. The formal legal proceedings, once fully underway, moved through several distinct phases over the following 5 months. The first hearing established the clear, unbroken chain of water rights. My grandfather's original 1954 appropriation filing, my father's continuous renewal and documentation through 1998, and my own uninterrupted maintenance of that same filing across the following 25 years, all properly recorded with the State Water Board and never once lapsed or successfully challenged by any competing claim. The second hearing focused specifically on the actual draining incident and the Water Board's own permitting failure, with a representative from the board's own compliance office testifying that the temporary diversion permit should never have been issued given the clearly documented senior rights on file, an acknowledgement that considerably strengthened both my civil claim against Ridgemont Crossing and a separate regulatory action the Water Board itself eventually pursued against its own permitting office for the systemic database cross-referencing failure. Cordelia Prout testified during the third hearing, describing her own overlooked concerns and Vivienne's unfounded assurance that the lake constituted shared community property. Testimony that Gideon paired directly with the internal committee notes, confirming Vivienne had never once actually verified that claim through any legitimate channel. When questioned directly regarding why she had authorized a construction project, premised entirely on an assumption she had never bothered to confirm, Vivienne's answer offered little beyond an acknowledgement that 15 years of the development's own marketing language had led her to genuinely believe the lake's shared status was simply an established, uncontested fact, despite never once having spoken with me directly to confirm anything of the sort. The court's ruling, issued roughly 3 weeks after the final hearing, left no ambiguity whatsoever. My family's senior appropriative water rights were formally reaffirmed in their entirety. The unauthorized diversion permit was retroactively voided, and Ridgemont Crossing Homeowners Association was held liable for the full cost of ecosystem restoration, professional dam and shoreline engineering assessment, fish restocking, and a considerable additional sum reflecting the loss of use and enjoyment my family had experienced during the months it took to properly refill and restore the lake to anything resembling its previous condition. The Ridgemont Crossing Board voted to remove Vivienne Castellano from the presidency within weeks of the ruling becoming public, and Cordelia Prout was elected to fill the vacant position, one of her first formal actions being a complete, independent review of every claim the association had ever made regarding shared amenities or community resources bordering the development, a review that confirmed no other similarly unfounded claims existed elsewhere, suggesting the lake situation had reflected one individual's persistent, uncorrected assumption rather than any broader institutional pattern within Ridgemont Crossing itself. Kessler Lake took the better part of 18 months to properly refill and restore. Working with a hydrology engineer, Gideon helped me retain to ensure the dam and shoreline received proper professional assessment following the sudden, unauthorized draining. I want to describe standing at that same shoreline roughly 2 years after the incident, watching my own grandchildren cast fishing lines into water that had been restocked with bass and bluegill, sitting beside the same small memorial bench where my father's ashes had been scattered, now properly positioned beside the water once again rather than stranded in dried mud. I think about my grandfather often when I'm out at that lake, remembering the stories my own father told me about watching Otto Kessler dig that first section of dam by hand, one shovel load at a time. 3 full years of patient, deliberate labor building something he believed would belong to his family permanently. I don't think he ever could have imagined a homeowners association pumping his lake dry overnight to build a parking lot, treating 70 years of documented senior water rights as though they were simply an inconvenient formality, standing between a development and its own premium amenity ambitions. But I believe, given everything I know about the kind of patient, thorough man he was throughout his entire life, that he would have recognized exactly what mattered most in the end, that a piece of water, properly documented and properly defended, belongs to whoever holds the actual legal right to it, regardless of how confidently anyone else might have spent years simply assuming otherwise. If this story hit home for you, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel keep growing. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next one, because there are plenty more stories just like this one still to come. Drop a comment down below and let me know what you thought of this one, or whether your own family has ever had to defend something that took generations to build against an assumption that formed in just a few careless years. I read every single comment, and honestly, some of the best stories on this channel started as a comment somebody left on a video just like this.